What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Aliens vs. Avengers, the amazing comic book series that Marvel releases once every 4 months. So, what we're going to do here in order to kind of get you guys caught up on everything is refresh, right? Because I know I needed it. I'm sure you guys did. So the whole idea is that Aliens vs. Avengers is the story of how the Xenomorphs basically kill the Marvel Universe. Like, they overrun Earth, they wipe out pretty much all the superheroes. It's absolutely nuts. And it all started because of David 8. Now, keep in mind that the Sigourney Weaver Alien franchise is its own thing way out there that has nothing to do with the Marvel multiverse. Instead, what writer Jonathan Hickman did is he took those elements and then brought them into the Marvel multiverse and then made a few changes into it. So while we don't really get a numerical designation for the universe that David 8 and all those guys come from, David 8, of course, played by Michael Fassbender in Prometheus and Alien Covenant, we do know that much like what we saw in Alien Covenant, David showed up on the home world of the Engineers, the beings responsible for the creation of humanity in the universe where David comes from. But unlike Alien Covenant, David was not alone. There were actually like 3 or 4 different synthetics that were all different versions of David. And so much like Alien Covenant, they unleashed the black goo, the substance that effectively creates xenomorphs. It was a very primitive version of the xenomorph creation process, but it ultimately leads to the creation of xenomorphs. And all the engineers were essentially wiped out. Of course, we'll actually find out that was not necessarily the case. And that over the course of thousands of years, David and the synthetics had traveled across their universe and spread the xenomorphs to every corner of it. Every world in their universe was infested with xenomorphs, and all life outside of themselves and the xenomorphs was eradicated. Now, we don't know if predators, for example, existed in their universe, but the fact is, David and the synthetics discovered the multiverse. And when that happened, they jumped into it. And the first place they arrived was this version of the Marvel Universe, which again, this is an alternate reality version of the main Marvel Universe. Or maybe it's in the future, right? I don't think Marvel really explains which universe it's in. But one of the things that's explained by Hickman is the timeline from when a xenomorph arrives on Earth, or a person infected with a xenomorph shows up on Earth, to the time in which Earth is overrun. And under normal circumstances, for a world to be raised by the xenomorphs, it would take about a year. That when David 8 and the various synthetics showed up in the Marvel Universe, they spread across the entirety of the universe, starting with the Milky Way galaxy, like a plague. And what they would do is they would send a host infected with a xenomorph queen to a world. Now, the timeline that Hickman gave us is he would say that from the time the person arrived on that planet and the queen burst out of their chest, it would take about a year in order for the queen to generate enough xenomorphs for that force to overwhelm and take over the world. But what David 8 and his guys did is they didn't send just one person infected with a queen, they sent 4. And so that 1-year timeline became 3 months. What this meant was that when Earth was hit, right, when it was attacked by David and his guys, and 4 xenomorph queens showed up here, by the time the superheroes on Earth realized that they were being attacked, by the time they realized that xenomorphs were overrunning cities, it was far too late. The xenomorph numbers were far too large, in the millions, more than the superheroes could contend with. And so by the time Earth fell, while we don't know a lot about what happened with the various superheroes, what we do know is that seemingly the Incredible Hulk was dead, or at least we're kind of left to believe he's dead. We're left to believe that Apocalypse is dead. We don't know what happened to Doctor Doom. Captain America is dead. Pretty much the only surviving superheroes on Earth are the Wakandans, who took off to space because of the intergalactic empire of Wakanda, the various survivors of the mutant community who weren't destroyed by the xenomorphs who took off to Mars, and then you have Miles Morales, Carol Danvers, and Tony Stark. And that's it. Right now, there were some human survivors, and of course, they're on this gigantic spaceship that was built by Tony Stark as a kind of life raft in order to get them to a safe place, or at the very least, if there are no safe worlds in the universe, to just kind of turn the ship into a generational ship, where essentially what's left of humanity just lives on the ship in perpetuity until the end of all things. I don't know. Or they find a way to destroy all the xenomorphs on some world and make themselves safe. But that's where we pick up with what's going on right now. Because when they initially took off, the ship itself was actually damaged, meaning they have to travel to Mars and they have to go to the X-Men in order to attain some supplies in order for Tony Stark to repair the ship. The issue with this is they don't know exactly how things are going to transpire. Hickman, in a lot of ways, is kind of building on the work he did with House and Powers of X. And in fact, you'll see some callbacks to Secret Wars 2015 here. It's why I always say, you can read Jonathan Hickman's work in isolation in chronological order, and it disturbs nothing, right? It's one of the coolest things about how Hickman writes his stories. And so the concern is showing up here on Mars could be met with resistance. It could be met with mutants just taking them prisoner and killing them all because they don't want to have to concern themselves with a potential xenomorph outbreak, especially because Miles is carrying a face hugger, right? That's one of the things that we saw at the end of the first issue. A face hugger almost implanted Miles with a xenomorph egg, but Miles had the Venom symbiote. We didn't know he had the symbiote, but he had the Venom symbiote. The symbiote in turn encased the face hugger and took it over. So now the facehugger is not really a threat. And then Venom rebonded itself to Miles. And then it gave him like a facehugger design on his chest. Miles' costume looks amazing. It looks so dope in this story. But again, kind of getting into the meat and potatoes of issue number 3, what they end up doing is arriving on Mars. And when they get there, it's kind of like, okay, like when's the last time you were here, Tony, right? And he says somewhere around 20 years ago. And he's like, I was here for personal reasons. What about you, Carol? And she's like, I was here 7 years ago. It was the busiest spaceport I'd ever seen. This is coming from a woman who's traveled the cosmos. And so as they get out there, Miles is just kind of like, guys, I got a bad feeling, man. Right now, keep in mind, Tony Stark is exceedingly old, right? Everybody's old in this story because it takes place in the far-flung future of the MCU. So it's not the present day. Now, Tony Stark, of course, being an older guy, they're kind of like, look, Gramps, right? I mean, you're confined to a wheelchair, that kind of thing. And unless it's going to be some kind of video game where Professor Xavier fights Magneto, you're going to have to stay here, right? And ultimately, Stark's like, no, that's not going to happen because this wheelchair isn't just a wheelchair, it's a suit. Because of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? And Miles is ecstatic about this, right? He's just kind of like, I can see that now. Like, this is amazing, right? We actually have a mobile Iron Man on our side. And that's when you switch over to Bar Sinister. Now, Bar Sinister was one of the coolest ideas that Jonathan Hickman came up with during Secret Wars 2015. The idea behind Bar Sinister is that there is the main Mr. Sinister himself, right? The one that we all know and love with the diamond on his head. But technically, Bar Sinister is basically composed of a bunch of different versions of Mr. Sinister. Now, seemingly, while they all do have their own personalities and so on and so forth, Sinister Prime is Sinister Prime. He leads them all. And he kind of goes on this amazing speech here, right? Because he says, you know what we have here, don't you? It's undeniable. It's irrefutable. It's glorious. It's absolute perfection. Because what Sinister has in his possession is a face hugger. And he says, we've spent our entire lives, whatever, we've spent all that time seeking out the possible genetic ends of not just what we are, but what we can be. And in this, we have finally found our answer. This creature is the starting point of a universal extinction machine, while also quite perfectly a historical container for the genetic remnants of its hosts. Because remember, xenomorphs copy the DNA of the hosts that they are born out of. And so he says, yes, it is your end, but it is also your forever. And most of all, the ideal representation of all we have learned about society. We are born in pain, consume everything, and leave nothing but annihilation in our wake. And it's revealed to us that seemingly all the X-Men on this planet were infected with xenomorphs by Sinister. Like literally, he's just totally destroyed this planet. Now, it's the most sinister thing that a person could do. No pun intended, man. This is diabolical. If I'm being honest with you guys, this is next level. Just wow, dude. He killed a world for the sake of a science experiment, but it's exactly the kind of thing Sinister would do. Now, in the middle of this, right, another Sinister comes running up to Sinister Prime, interrupts his speech, which pisses him off, and then he tells him a ship has landed here, right? And so at that point, Sinister's like, okay, right, let's just kind of see what this brings. And so ultimately you have Miles and those guys who were just kind of like, man, it's too quiet out here, right? Like something's not right, like something weird is going on. And that's where Stark is like, I pick up a heat signature. When they travel to it, they meet Sinister. And it's really interesting because right off the bat, they're like, what have you done? Because Sinister's a bad guy, right? Whenever you see Sinister, there's never really an instance of like, oh, hey, what's up, Nathan? How you been doing, man? Let's get a cup of coffee and catch up. It's just like, Sinister's here, and he's about to destroy everything you know and love. And so he responds here like, normally I'd be offended by the implication, but there's no denying these dirty hands, is there? For so long, we believed that mutants were the singular dominant species in the solar system. How wrong we were, and how unforgiving the lesson of extinction was. And that's where Miles is like, are you the only one who survived? And the response of Sinister is, I am not. And so that's where Miles asks, like, where is everybody at? And Sinister's response, well, it's interesting that you should ask that, because what happens is while this conversation is unfolding, back at the colony ship, the other Sinisters are showing up here to basically attack all the humans who survived the invasion of Earth and are on this ship basically just trying to live. And one of these guys, right, one of these Sinisters, which I'll be honest, man, it's dark and it's twisted, but it's hilarious because one of these Sinisters is like, visitors to our humble mutant planet, we welcome you with open arms and come bearing gifts. Do you know what this is? And one of the guys is like, no. And he's like, it's a gun, human, a gun that shoots face huggers, which I have to be honest with you guys, man, this is amazing. It's one of the most amazing things that I think I've ever seen. Now, it is also terrible because they're literally infecting every single human on this ship. And so at that point, it's just kind of like, okay, any exit strategy that Stark and those guys had, it's game over. There's no way they get off this planet in one piece. And that's where Carol is like, I'm getting an alert from the ship. Stark patches in, and literally they see a broadcast of all these people being infected with facehuggers by Sinister. And at that point, like, Stark's just beside himself, man. He's like, I mean, how could you do this? Like, I mean, even for you as a villain, this is just terrible. It's a diabolical thing to do. And Sinister's just like, oh, I did what I always do. I adapt and I overcome. And all these Xenomorphs come out of nowhere. Now, here's the crazy thing about it. They're not attacking Sinister. So seemingly, they're following his orders. They're doing what it is that he tells them to do. And so it looks as though Sinister has the ability to control Xenomorphs, or perhaps these Xenomorphs were genetically modified in such a way by Sinister to where they always follow his orders. And he says, I conquer evolution, I defeat Darwin, and I just can't help myself. I always side with the winners. And so at that point, it's game on, right? Stark is just firing everywhere he can. It's like, we have to get out of here, right? He's like, pushing back enough for us to get clear of the square. Make for the ship. We have to get out of here as fast as we can. And while nobody really says it, the reality is that with them knowing the ship's under attack, at the end of the day, it's, we'll deal with that when we get there. This is the biggest threat we have to contend with right now. Now, of course, Miles responds and saying, hey, look, I'll take care of Tony Stark. But the response of Carol is, no, we're more powerful if we stick together. And that's where he's like, okay, cool. I'll grab Stark, right? And he immediately races after to go get Tony Stark. Now, the reality here is, despite how capable Carol Danvers is, the Venom symbiote being able to overcome a facehugger would indicate that within the context of this whole situation, Miles is the best asset they have at their disposal. Because what we have not seen yet is what it looks like when the Venom symbiote fights a Xenomorph. And so it's one of the coolest things, because with Carol Danvers attacking these, she's hit with the acid of the Xenomorphs. Now remember, this is a highly potent acid, right? It's almost like a molecular acid, as it's kind of been stated in the Xenomorph franchise. Essentially what that means is no one is immune to the effects of Xenomorph acid. And so Carol Danvers' whole side of her face is completely scarred up. And at that point, it's just like, okay, Carol Danvers is about to die. Son. A portal opens up and Emma Frost in her diamond form with armor come through. And it's crazy because she's just like, is she alive? And this guy's just like, yeah, this one's never had an ounce of quit in her. And Carol addresses him as Logan. Wolverine survived! Dude, it's crazy. And of course he did, right? It makes perfect sense. And if anything, Wolverine's kind of like the perfect host for Xenomorphs. So now we know where he went to, because my initial thought before was that Wolverine was just taken by the Xenomorphs and will just perpetually create Xenomorphs, because you could create an army off of this guy, right? One burst out of his chest, he heals, he's infected again. One burst out of his chest, he heals, he's infected again, so on and so forth. And so at that point, Carol's just like, we have to get Tony, we have to get Miles. And so they're like, no, we're leaving. we need to get out of here as fast as we can. With that being said, guys, we're not going to bring this video to an end because there's still more stuff. So what this does is this actually picks up with us learning that Manifold is here. Now, Manifold's really, really cool. This guy has the ability to basically bend the universe in on itself and jump across time. Now, there is more to his character, but honestly, within the confines of this story, none of that really matters. The only thing that really is important here is he's a teleporter. He can get them from point A to point B. Now, the conversation that happens here is really awesome because Carol's just kind of like, I'm breathing Manifold, right? It's good enough. I'm not in the best condition. I'm sure my face is 8 kinds of scarred up, but where are we, right? Where are all the others? And the response of Emma is, we're about 50 clicks from the spaceport that you landed at. We caught a glimpse of Spider-Man and Stark before they were overrun. About an hour after we escaped with you, the ship that you came in went up in a fireball. There are no others, Captain. You are looking at the sole human and mutant survivors on Mars. And that's where she's like, you're forgetting Sinister, right? Like, why don't they kill him? And the response of Armor here is, the White Queen originally suspected that he'd once again manipulated his genetic code. A few days ago, I tore one in half and discovered that he's carrying one of their eggs around in his chest. I think he somehow messed with the incubation cycle and prolonged it, but that's just a guess. If you want to know more, you'll have to ask one of the Sinisters yourselves. Now, that is actually a great string to tug on by Jonathan Hickman, because as garbage as the movie was, we know from Alien 3 that if a person is infected with a xenomorph will not kill them, right? Like, the propagation of their species is the only thing they care about. Now, of course, Ripley was infected with a xenomorph queen, so it could very well be that those were kind of extenuating circumstances, and that in reality, if she was infected with a regular xenomorph, then the dog alien running around probably would have just killed her for inconveniencing it, right? But whatever the case is, that seemingly Sinister is immune, but it doesn't quite answer the question of how he's able to control them. And maybe it just looked like he was controlling them, right? The xenomorphs saw Stark and everybody and we're like, we're gonna kill him, and that's it. And so it looks like control when it's actually not. But at the end of the day, Emma Frost says Armor's theory is yet unproven, but it does make sense. And so at that point, Carol's like, okay, thanks for the rescue, guys, and for patching me up, but like, I gotta head back in, right? Like, I have to know if Tony's dead, and I have to know what happened to the others. If there's a chance that anyone is still alive, I have to go. And that's where Wolverine steps up, and he says, you don't know what it is that you're facing here, Carol. They will not stop. They can't stop. It's what they are, and it's what they exist to do. Myself, Armor, and Emma cannot be harmed by these things, right? Emma has her diamond form, Armor has her armor form, Wolverine heals, and as he explains, Eden is sitting inside his manifold when we travel, so he cannot be touched, but you can be. Stay here and let us protect you. But that's where Carol is actually kind of like, no, like, I need to go, because it's not just about satisfying some measure of curiosity. I made a promise to myself that I would never leave anyone else behind. It was my code. But the reality is that when we left Earth, I did. I left behind all the superheroes whose fates were unknown, who may have survived, who may not have survived. I left behind Captain America. He was still fighting when the ship was taking off. We left behind the Incredible Hulk. I will not do that again. And so ultimately, Wolverine's like, I'll go with you. And so once they teleport right back to what used to be the home of the X-Men and the mutant population, they turn a corner and there's all these bodies of xenomorphs all over the place, but they also find the body of Tony Stark with a xenomorph having broken out of his chest. So Tony Stark's dead, right? And at that point, Carol's just kind of like, God, man, you deserved so much better than this. We all do. But in the middle of all of this, we find out that it's not just Wolverine and Carol, right? It's also Armor and Manifold, right? They've come along for the ride, but then their eyes look up to the sky. Something's caught their attention. 2 ships arrive on Mars, and that's when Carol's like, the Wakandans are here. Wakanda's returned. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Massive cliffhanger right now. And you know what's worse? We have to wait until May to find out what happens next. Marvel, get it together. But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.